And thank you very much to the St John Wesley Foundation for their support of this event as well, and the Southlands Trust. So as has been already said, my name is Father Luke. I'm an Anglican priest based in the town of Bedford in Bedfordshire and studying here at Roehampton for a doctorate in practical theology. This is only my third time on campus, despite having been studying here for nearly 2 years, which is for the word that we won't mention. I've been involved in projects which support people experiencing homelessness for about 10 years, and many of those projects have been faith-based. A lot of my experience and a lot of the critiques I want to bring today relate specifically to church and to Christianity, but I hope, because that's been my experience, but I hope that they'll at least be relevant or interesting to people of all faiths and none who care about justice. Forgive the picture of me in my finery. It's because Nick inspired a river blessing that we did in Bedford last Sunday, so that was just a little nod to you, Nick. My most formative experiences as a minister occurred during my time as a volunteer chaplain at a day centre for people experiencing homelessness in Luton. One morning, one of the regulars came to me during breakfast. He said, "I've got something I really want to show you." So I followed him into the day room, where he produced a large suitcase. As he opened the suitcase, he said, "I've got 2 guns, and I want to show them to you because you look like you know what to do with them." At this point, my heart rate increased a little bit. He continued, "I carry my 2 guns with me everywhere to keep me safe." At that point, I started looking for something large and heavy to disarm him with. The gentleman rifled around through his suitcase and then suddenly pulled out 2 dark objects and said, "Aha!" He stood there with his 2 guns and a big smile, saying, "These are my 2 guns, a Bible and a yoga manual, to keep my soul and my body safe and healthy." And we became fast friends. One of the many problems in churches, Christian organisations and others' responses to homeless people is that they put the homeless first and the person second, if at all. Reactions to people experiencing homelessness are often like mine was: fear, aggression, suspicion, misunderstanding, stereotyping. But so rarely are people experiencing homelessness treated as people. Homelessness is a lot more than our stereotypes about rough sleeping. Many people are legally homeless because they do not have access to safe, appropriate, accessible and affordable homes. Now, having once sent someone a WhatsApp message in the middle of their talk that was quite naughty, I should probably have set my notifications on. Let's just roll it back. People who experience homelessness of its various different kinds really are people just like you and me. People with dreams, people with hopes, hobbies, passions, and all the other weird things that make us human. So I'm going to share 3 ways that Christian and maybe other faith responses to homelessness might need to change. The first relates directly to religion. Religion's a pretty taboo topic in society today. I found it's much more tolerable to discuss politics and sex in polite company than it is to mention the G word. A common concern is that faith-based charities will use their work as an opportunity to convert people and get them to join their churches or faith communities or whatever. A 2015 research report from the Theos think tank argued that despite this common concern, it's relatively rare for faith-based organisations to try to proselytise, and that's the technical word usually used to try and convert people. It's fairly rare for faith-based organisations to try and proselytise the people that they support. But while it may be rare, it's certainly not unheard of. Some years ago, my wife Jenny and I were involved in a charity that supported sex workers, most of whom were experiencing some form of homelessness. And the charity used to amaze eager supporters from local churches with their social media posts about the number of women who'd come to Bible study or who'd asked the Bible to drop in, or who'd been prayed for by volunteers and had a spiritual experience. And they used to share a lot of this stuff through their social media as well. I don't know if they ever asked permission to do that. The problem is no one ever actually asked the women what they thought about all of this. An example of this was when one very special lady that we befriended said to my wife Jenny and I, just before a visit from the charity's CEO, "Oh, they're not going to be doing that fucking praying again, are they?" There are clear ethical issues here in the use of religion in the power dynamics between service providers and those who depend on their support. But it's not enough to just banish God from the drop-in. Frankly, I think it's the most likely place that you'd find her. In 2013, the Lost and Found report was published, which explored the faith and spirituality in the lives of people experiencing homelessness. And this report demonstrated that despite the reservations of many institutions, a very high proportion of people experiencing homelessness saw faith and spirituality as very important parts of their lives, and were often very eager to talk about it. The report encouraged the creation of safe and well-facilitated spaces for people experiencing homelessness to talk about their faith and their spirituality. I know personally my own faith and theology have been radically reshaped by people who've been excluded and oppressed. They've taught me, in the words of womanist theologian Monica Coleman, the rock-bottom faith we cling to at 2 o'clock in the morning when we can't sleep. The kind of faith that survives burying people who we didn't manage to help in time. Faith and theology from the edges really should be very natural for Christians. And as I say, I'm speaking from my own experience here as a Christian minister. Jesus is crystal clear in his teaching that whatever we do or don't do for the least of these, as it's sometimes translated, we do or don't do for him. Jesus of Nazareth is only ever found at the edges. He said of himself, "Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Jesus' mother Mary, whose feast day is tomorrow, gives us a very clear picture of what this rock-bottom faith in her son should look like. Mary, a displaced woman of colour, sang a song called the Magnificat, which we Anglicans recite every day during evening prayer. She sang, "The Almighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name." She believed in a God who is on her side, a God who casts down the mighty from their thrones and lifts up the lowly, who fills the hungry with good things and sends the rich away empty. It's all there in the Bible, in case you think I'm quoting the Communist Manifesto here. It's now to this talk of thrones, the rich, and the lifting of the lowly that I want to turn. So I've talked a bit about religion and faith. The next problem area to address is politics and economics. Now, I'm not a scholar of either, but I do have a few thoughts on the matter. Veteran preacher Tony Campolo says that mixing religion and politics is like mixing ice cream and manure. The manure isn't affected much, but the ice cream gets ruined. I think we're seeing some pretty alarming examples of this mixing of religion and politics in the US, in Russia, and indeed in our ongoing colonial history in England. My own denomination, the Church of England, has often been called the Tory party of prayer. So I ask, how the hell did we get from Mary's song about the mighty being cast down from their thrones and the rich being sent away empty to the Tory party of prayer? There's a long history of the Church having an inappropriate relationship with political and economic power. Many churches and organisations would describe their work around issues like homelessness as part of their mission. The problem is that the history of the church's mission, especially in the established Church of England, is deeply bound up with the history of colonialism and the exploitation of people and their resources. Missionaries were often sent with colonisers to the majority world. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann describes this as being chaplains to power, the religious wing of the colonial project. The problem is, I'm really not that sure that things have changed all that much. Many churches and Christian organisations still seem to try to colonise spaces which are populated largely by people who are working class and or of majority world heritages. They sweep in to save the day and they swallow up all the funding from local authorities and grant givers. And as my old man taught me, whoever pays the piper calls the tune. I've seen this play out in my current local context. Charities become aware of outrageous injustices perpetrated by the local government and local organisations, but they won't speak out for fear of losing their funding or being labelled too political. This may seem like a sort of incidental relationship to the Church's colonial history, but British Black liberation theologian Anthony Revd has argued that the very narrative of white British exceptionalism, which has led us to the neoliberal capitalist Brexit gangster state that rule us today, is based on the legacy of white European imperial mission Christianity and its sense of self-entitlement and manifest destiny. I would argue that this legacy looks less like Jesus and Mary's radical vision of justice, and more like the only European man in the New Testament and the creeds of the Church, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And just like Pontius Pilate did to Jesus, the Church of today would rather wash its hands of responsibility than engage with the systemic, political and economic injustices which lead to homelessness and poverty. In other words, the Church has forsaken and crucified the Christ of the poor. The question of how churches and other faith organisations respond to homelessness is therefore a question of justice, not of charity. What might Jesus of Nazareth say to churches of today? And I'm talking about the real Jesus of Nazareth, not that white idol that we have up in so many Anglican churches. I don't think that way. He certainly isn't Jesus. What might Jesus say to churches who court the favours of the powerful? Probably the same thing he said to the rich young ruler. Sell everything you have, give the money to the poor, and come and follow me. I was taught in vicar school that sermons are always supposed to end with a practical application, so that's where I will land. We've talked a bit about God casting down the mighty from their thrones and sending the rich away empty. But what about lifting up the lowly and filling the hungry with good things? If, as I've argued from the Christian tradition, God is to be found among the outcast, the lowly, the oppressed, then how should we respond? The established church in the UK is rapidly losing its place of wealth, power and significance in society. Church attendance is in terminal decline, particularly in the traditionally white-dominated established churches like the Church of England, Methodist Church, etc. We're currently rapidly approaching the most holy season of the year for Christians, Easter. And Easter is a time when we retell the story of a poor Middle Eastern revolutionary who was murdered by one of the most powerful and vicious empires that's ever existed, but who somehow, we believe as Christians, overcame not only empire but death itself. As the previous Bishop of Guyana once reminded me when I asked him about decline in his own city. We share a story about things falling to the ground and dying so that they can be reborn. My own hope is for the church to die and be reborn as something that looks a little bit more like Jesus and Mary and a little bit less like Pontius Pilate. One of the ways we might get there is to start giving up our addiction to power, to money, and even to charity. Charity means doing things for people, whether the motivation is to count in how many people we get into the pews, or to count out the good things that we've done so that we can pat ourselves on the back. And I think in a male-dominated church, there's something about that male need to measure things which is at play here too. Charity is about doing good things for oppressed people without ever challenging the things causing their oppression, and without respecting those people as equals. In contrast to this, Mary's vision of the lowly being lifted up means the empowering of leaders to shape and change their own communities. Because, as we say in community organising, those who are closest to the pain are closest to the solution. Through organising for justice in solidarity with the oppressed, churches and other faith and non-faith-based organisations can take part in that process. Organising is about building people power, not building impressive projects. Through community organising, we bring people of all faiths and none together, people of peace who care about justice and the common good. And we can raise up leaders and challenge the power holders that perpetuate the systems of injustice. One of the ways that we've been doing that in Bedford and with my colleague Mike from Charity Just Us is through challenging housing issues. I think for those of us who walk through the world protected by a bit of power and privilege of various kinds, I believe that to be a follower of the real Jesus of Nazareth means to be willing to commit acts of treason against the systems and structures of oppression in our society, recognising that this might not win us many friends from the country club. I've always thought I was a bit more trailer park than country club anyway. My bishop, and I come into close here, my bishop paid me a very sideways compliment recently. He said he'd just met with the brand new chief exec of Bedford Borough Council, and I asked him how that went, and his response was, yes, she's been warned about you already. I wonder what it would be like if faith communities and faith leaders were people that the powerful get warned about. Because we can't just sit and pray and hope everything will be all right. We need to stand up and resist the evil injustices of our age. As my friend Anthony Reddy always says, tell the truth and shame the devil. Thank you.